Welcome to A Good Man is Hard to Find podcast. We will be addressing what it means to be a male lay Catholic leader in response to the modern day church crisis. Today we'll be giving you an overview of who we are and what that means. How do we respond?
Stay tuned.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Klinsky. I'm here with my buddy.
Hey, I'm James Spinello.
And we'll get into it in a little bit why we have this podcast. But I guess to start, like I said, my name is Andrew. I was born and raised in Southern California, specifically Pasadena. Nice area to have a fam. Local kid, been here pretty much my whole life. Went to college out at LMU to stay close to my family. So never really left. No reason to. Just kidding. There are lots of reasons to leave LA. But there's
reasons to stay.
That's true too. Like this beautiful room that we're in right now.
Welcome to A Good Man is Hard to Find.
Well, hang on, James. I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. Who are you? Where are you from?
Well, my name is James Spinello. I'm from Houston, Texas, the swampy Houston, Texas, which has raised me to be a man who knows how to sweat after a long childhood of doing so. But after getting to LA, a little bit less so.
Yeah, and James, what do you do for a living?
I'm a filmmaker. Okay. I'm a poet and a lunatic.
There you go.
In that order, mostly.
Got it. Nice.
Thankfully, sometimes every once in a while, lunatic jumps to the front.
Oh, okay.
But
never would have guessed.
Well, it's a constant struggle, Andrew. Constant struggle.
I see.
But I think other things about me might be in order. I'm also a huge baseball fan.
Are you?
Absolutely. I grew up playing it, played it through college, and still think of myself as a weekend warrior from time to time, or weeknight warrior. But also was a history minor back in school. Beyond going to film school, I was just interested in that whole how we got to where we are now.
You mean there are things that happened before today?
A little known fact, yes.
Wow. Learning something new, folks. Learning something new.
And behind the scenes, we have our wonderful engineer, Barnaby Coxon. Barnaby, say hello to the good people.
Hello. Barnaby, from the control room.
Barnaby hails from New Zealand. He's a Kiwi.
Middle Earth. Yeah.
And he's actually levels up this whole production.
He does. Just his presence alone.
Aw. Thanks, guys.
Barnaby, if you had to pick your favorite sport, what might that be?
Oh, rugby.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a great game.
I mean, I wonder if any of you guys play rugby. It's
funny that you
sport.
ask. I actually happen to play. I play for a club team in Pasadena. If anybody's interested, you can find us on Facebook or through a quick Google search. We need more people. Feel free to join anytime. It's a great sport.
Wow.
It's a great sport.
What a guy.
I'm going to be helping you out actually soon because I'm going to be shooting a film about the pro team up in Seattle.
So I actually went with some of the guys from the club last year for the MLR championship game in San Diego and watched Seattle win the championship.
Dang.
That was a fun experience.
Well, I'll say hello to the guys on the team for you.
Yeah, please do. They won't know who I am, but that's okay.
So why are we here? What brings us to this podcast?
That's a great question, James. You're the history major, so maybe we could learn something from the past before we talk about the present.
That's a good idea. I think one of the something that brings us to this point is that we're both Catholic.
Oh, we are?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I guess I forget that sometimes, but I do my best to remember.
I think we all forget that idea from time to time, that ideal of what it means to be Catholic and the virtues that are espoused to it. But I think, at least in our lifetimes, we're undergoing as Catholics the worst crisis that we've as a church ever faced. And perhaps even in the past 500 years, the worst crisis the church has faced yet. And what I was searching to do is, what is the response of us as young Catholic men in the church? What is young Catholic laity in the church. What is our response? How do we face this crisis? And in doing that, I realized we have to look introspective. We have to take an introspective look at our own life. And that leads us to where we are now.
Yeah, and I think, just before we delve too deep into that question, it's important to acknowledge that James and I bring a fairly, I don't want to say specific, but perhaps limited perspective. We're both young men. We're both in LA. That's a big city. And so, what you see in a city versus a smaller area, or how we see things as men might be different than how females see things, etc. So I just want to acknowledge before we get too far into this that James and I are not saying that we have all the answers, nor that we know everything. But we're both two people who felt moved or called to respond to what's happening, and felt that the most appropriate outlet for us, something that we both felt called to do, is have this podcast. And I think that it's that first movement, perhaps of the spirit, perhaps of emotion, but either way, we're taking action. And I think that in some ways, it's not necessarily the best example of what we're called to do in response to answer your question more directly. I don't necessarily think action is the first step, but I do think, as you were saying, that it's about a personal response. I think most generally, and of the most important thing to think about is that personal call to holiness. We see it in the scriptures when Jesus walks on water, or there's the storm and the disciples are sleeping, or we see it when Jesus is in the garden and he's about to go through the passion. There's always that call towards God. And I think people might be tempted to leave the church or walk away from the church. But I would argue that Scripture pretty obviously tells us that the response is never to turn away from God, and it's in these times that it's most important to turn towards God. And the best way to do that is, as Christ tells us, through prayer, fasting, and tithing. And so I think now more than ever, that personal call to holiness is so important, especially given all the different, societal struggles that we face as our politics and values get lost in modern times.
Yeah, the response from us that I've been praying about is a rededication to virtue in our everyday life. Finding out how can I seek a deeper understanding of virtue? How can I incorporate that habit of binding myself closer to God through my faith, through this pursuit of virtue in my daily life? And that is what I'm hoping those type of questions are what I'm hoping to discuss in this podcast.
Yeah, I think the Catholic faith has a very long and rich tradition and history. And, I would say it would be misleading to say that every podcast is going to address this question directly, but in some ways you could talk about any aspect of the Catholic faith and it would touch on the answer to this question. So I think it's difficult to talk about all aspects of the Catholic faith and directly answer this question, but at the same time, I think it would be incomplete to try to answer this question without talking about all aspects of the Catholic faith.
Yeah, you look at it, sure, we could be a scattershot from time to time, but the fact of the matter is, when you look at the church, when you're in the church pew, the majority of what you see is not men. The majority of what you're going to see in your regular Catholic church is going to be old ladies and the priest. Men are vacant to a large degree within the church.
And even then, when you do see men, I would say, 90%, 95% of the men that are there, and maybe that varies from parish to parish. I think that's possible. But even then, the men that are there, I at least from what I've seen, are married men with kids. I would say with much infrequency and irregularity do I see single men, particularly single young men, who attend Mass on their own.
And we're not saying that being in Mass is the be all end all of religion, of the Catholic faith. However, it is the centerpiece of Catholic prayer.
Well, and it's an indicator, right? I mean, the first question that comes to someone's mind, colloquially or anecdotally, when I say or you say or someone at a bar says that they're Catholic, oh, do you go to church? I mean, there's something about the Mass that people find some sort of innate or inherent comfort in or relationship to Catholicism.
Absolutely. So it is a good measuring stick for where we are as a church for male leadership. Because to be a leader, you must be a good man. To be a good man, you must know what the Catholic virtues are if you're a Catholic. And if you don't have any idea about what that is, how can you hope to try and attain the title of a good man? And thus the good man is hard to find.
Right, exactly. I mean, and even looking at the priesthood, right? I mean, I don't remember a time. I mean, and I'm still fairly young, so maybe this isn't my sample size is small, is what I'm trying to get at. But I would be happy to poll older people, and I'm willing to bet that I'm correct in saying this, that there's never been a time when cardinals and bishops and even priests were openly disagreeing with each other with as much frequency as they are today about issues of doctrine. You know, maybe if you go back to early times when the foundation was being established and things were getting hashed out, but you know, I just over basic things like I don't know, I can't think of a good example.
Like giving Eucharist to divorced people who have been divorced.
Yeah,
giving the Eucharist, which is actually that's more of a United States church problem, which is another bias that we should talk about. We both live in Los Angeles. We both live in the United States, and that's what I've heard. And this could be incorrect because I haven't checked the numbers, but that's 4% of the church. So we're talking about the problems of 4% of the universal church. That's going to be a huge bias. Here, giving communion to divorced couples is something that people talk about a lot, that people disagree about a lot. The church is pretty clear in other parts of the other parts of the world about their stance on that, and maybe that's something we could go into at a later date. But it's an example of the controversy that we face. However, you said something,
but the distinction that I want to make, that I'm trying to get at, is that previously when there were these councils, etc., like the rules or the foundation was being established. In today's world, the foundation has been established. Those rules have been discussed. The writings have been written. And we're talking about the interpretation of those things. And it's I don't think it's ever been interpreted so differently by like leadership before. You know what I mean? I don't think there's ever been such a stark disagreement over what those rules are, and I don't mean to sound too legalistic here, but I guess I'm just trying to speak to the discouragement that I feel at times in watching or in reading about the squabbles of church hierarchy.
You know, you're not alone in that discouragement. And that's something we need to address in this podcast. I think we had talked about earlier is having a general overview of church crises.
Yeah.
And just to speak to what the point is right now, this is not the first time that we've disagreed on every single point. That's an overstatement. We don't disagree on every single point. This is not the first time that we've disagreed on basic points so vastly and widely. Right. You look at the first crisis, the first major crisis of the church beyond the Roman persecution, you could say is the Arian heresy, where there was the quote, or someone woke up, it was in the year 400s, and someone said, "I woke up and the whole world had turned Arian." And that's where people vastly, just widely disagreed on the divinity of Christ. And that's a basic point that people completely were running around amok with and couldn't understand it. And then you look at later on, that wasn't in the great crisis of the time even. You look in the year 500, there was the fall of Rome, where the barbarians were overrunning everything, and it looked like culture, the Western culture itself, was not going to survive.
Right.
And that is a huge point. That might be an external, like this is a very much an internal enemy, like Arianism was, but that is a crisis that you could see. And then you look 100 years later, and again it's not 100, 500 years later, and it's the internal struggle again, where the East and the West split. The Patriarch of Constantinople split from the Patriarch of Rome.
Right.
Again, a huge disagreement on who is the head of the church. And then in the 500 years later, there is again an internal struggle where the Protestant Reformation. But then we look 500 years later, and now we're here. And this is the crisis of our time. It is without a doubt the crisis that people will look at 500 years later and say, this is what we're facing. I don't know what they're going to call it, but it's going to be called something.
Well, and I guess what I want to be careful of is I think it's easy to have a strong response because it's the crisis that we're dealing with, that we're living through, that we're experiencing, etc. But I want to be careful not to pull a classic millennial move and act like this is the biggest thing since the last crisis and that this crisis is even bigger than the last one. You know what I mean? But I think what's tough is that you can only speak to what you know, and we haven't really experienced a crisis this severe in recent memory. I mean, not just in our lifetimes, but in recent memory. And especially when you had a pope not too long ago in JP2 who really tried to unite the world and inspired so many people, to return to the church. And, we're going to see an increase in the not too distant future in the priesthood. We've already seen a rise in seminarians, and quite frankly, that's the work and the fruits of JP2's labor more so than any other pope.
100%.
So I think it's
it's the World Youth Days.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
well, in part. I mean, I think it was a lot of things, but I definitely agree that the World Youth Days were a huge factor.
Absolutely, the thing that people thought no one would go to. Yeah, JP2. I think I'm not overstating the fact that you and I would not be sitting in this room talking about this without JP2.
I mean, he added a mystery to the rosary,
and so that the listeners that know who we're talking about Saint Pope John Paul II, who was basically the pope from the 70s to the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And forgive me if Barnaby, you have to check that on me because I could be completely wrong.
Our sound engineer is now also our researcher.
He's hurriedly typing now. But in any case, we're here.
Here we are.
And the fact of the matter is, a good man is hard to find, and we need to find him.
But I think, I guess, how do I phrase this? Framing what that means, I think, is an important conversation to have.
Which we should frame it. Very good.
Well, I mean, what we look for is obviously going to be different, and I think it's a tough question to answer, right? Because it depends on what stage of life you're in and where you're at. Being single is going to look very different than dating someone, which is going to look very different than being engaged, which is different than being married, which is different than being a dad, which is different than being a grandfather, which is different entirely from being a priest. And, I think any good man has a sense of virtue, but virtue really only deals with mastery of the self. And I think it's that radical reliance on God and grace that really levels up, for lack of a better word or lack of better rhetoric, or that helps someone get to that next level. But, you hear the call of what it means to be a husband when St. Paul says that, wives be obedient to your husbands and husbands be ready to lay down your life for your wife. We see it in mostly in the example of Jesus Christ being crucified. You know, you lay down your life for the people that you love. So you know, I think it's easy to envision. I mean, I don't know if you've ever done this, but I know I've had my moments. You know, ISIS is running around. Oh, I want to join the Marines and go kick their ass. You know, I think it's easy to have those moments, but I think what's more difficult, and
I
where
wrote a script about that once.
and where and what really makes a good man, and why they're so tough to find, is because it's difficult to be a good man. Because to me, it's more about doing the little things on a daily basis. Have I said my morning prayer? Did I get to mass? Did I wake up on time? Did I live out the heroic minute?
What's the heroic minute?
You set an alarm, let's say for 6 a.m. You wake up at 6 a.m. without snoozing the alarm and jump right into the things that you need to do. You know,
I'm so bad at that. It's more the heroic half hour to me.
right. But that's the point. I think it's all those little things that really build virtue, because then it's you know, I mean, I don't know. I'm just skeptical of someone who can do it in the big moments when the lights are on, but refuses to put in the work behind the scenes, so to speak. I think, you know, sports analogies are great because it's something I'm really familiar with, but I also think they illustrate points very well. It'd be like an athlete who goes out and plays well on Sundays if you're a football fan, or a pitcher who pitches well, you know, in games, but refuses to work on his craft on a day-to-day basis, or doesn't take care of his body on a day-to-day basis. At some point that catches up with you, especially when we're dealing with the devil. I mean, temptation is real. The devil's real. You know, anyone who disagrees with that or doesn't believe in that, forgive me if I sound a little harsh, but you're wrong, and you should go read a book about spiritual warfare.
What's spiritual warfare? Man, you're throwing around these terms that...
I don't mean to demagogue things here, I guess. So spiritual warfare is just the battle between good and evil, very generally, more specifically between Christ and Satan. And I think we all experience it in some people experience it in a much more real way than others, but that's where you see things like exorcisms in extreme cases or examples.
Sounds like we should have an episode on spiritual warfare.
I think that'd be fascinating. It's a world, exorcisms at least, are a world I don't know much about, but I also think it's always dangerous to talk about that type of stuff. So I think that you and I would need to do our independent research to make sure that we're adequately prepared.
It sounds like we should have... someone quite powerful in that warfare spirit as a guest for that one.
Yep, absolutely.
But okay, first, I so many directions I want to go with what you just said. But the first thing I wanted to say is, yes, the circumstances of what it takes to be a good man vary from person to person. No one is the same, so the circumstances are going to change. However, the virtues that underlie what defines a good man are not subjective.
Absolutely.
So when we're talking about virtue, when we're talking about what it takes to be let's choose a virtue, chastity, what it takes to be a chaste man. The circumstances of what that means will vary from a married man to a single man, and then in particular to that married man and single man. But if you are looking at what chastity is, then we can have an episode on that. We can have an episode on what is the objective truth that underlies, is the underpinning of a chaste man.
Well, and I think that brings up a good point, or it's an assumption that we made that we haven't talked about, which is absolute truth.
Yes. Well, that sounds like another great episode about what I mean, if you're going to be talking about a good man is hard to find and what it takes to be a good man, then you should talk. We're going to be throwing around the term that what is objective truth or absolute truth, what is truth, and then we have to address what is the opposite, which is all things are relative, which is adopted in the large part by modernity. So if we're going to be talking about what is objective truth, we're talking about a idea that has almost gone from the modern vocabulary, about the fact that a truth, it will be relevant to all men.
Right.
So that is when you're talking about absolute truth, objective truth, the fact that virtue follows, it has a thorough line through all mankind, is something that we will be taking as a presupposition for now, but we should examine at a later date.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
unless you want to go deeper into what it means, like.
No, I mean, I agree with you, but I think that I think that's part of the problem, though, right? It's not difficult to conceptually explain what absolute or objective truth is, or truth with a capital T, but it's much harder for people, at least in my experience with the conversations that I've had with people. It seems like people don't want to accept that there is some sort of objectivity.
It's inconvenient.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know what the underpinnings are of people who don't believe in an absolute truth. I think it's too, do they not want to take responsibility for themselves? Do they just not believe it? Do they not see how relativism, like when put in practice, is an issue? Do they not take enough philosophy classes and are just not able to think well or critically? Is it a combination of those things? Is it something else that I'm not thinking of? I don't know. So I guess my point is just that I think it's difficult to have a constructive conversation about absolute truth in this forum because there are so many reasons why. I mean, and again, we could define it. I think that's easy enough to do. But in terms of moving hearts, which I think is our ultimate objective with this podcast, it might be a little bit tougher to do that.
Well, that I agree with you on the fact that we're here to move hearts, to make a difference not just in our lives by our examination of what it takes to be a good man, but by hopefully in our journey, in our questions that we throw out, that we examine, that we're able to help other people become better.
Yeah, and I hope for us too. I mean, James and I were talking about this before the podcast. We kind of see this as a two-way street. We believe that we're going to learn some stuff from other people, and we hope that other people learn some stuff from us. And that's the beautiful thing about the mystical body of Christ, which is that each person has a role to play in this world. And I mean, there's so many things to be said about this, I think. So I don't want to say too much because I'll just start talking in tangents, and if I haven't already. But everybody has a role to play, and I think that's part of the beauty of Christianity, which is that we're all in this together, and figuratively speaking, we're all rowing the same boat. And just to circle back to what I was talking about earlier, for me, that's part of the reason that I feel so much discouragement when we have bishops arguing with bishops, or cardinals arguing with cardinals. And I suppose it's kind of like family fighting with family. And in certain situations, I think one ideology was clearly correct and the other was clearly wrong. But
now, in hindsight,
yeah, well, I mean, sometimes even in the moment, depending on what specific letters we're talking about. But my larger point is that there doesn't seem to be harmony. There seems to be some tension. That's perhaps malice. Perhaps malice. I don't know that it is, but perhaps.
Do you mean malice from one Catholic bishop, one bishop to another, or what exactly do you mean?
I don't know, James. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't seem like they don't seem like healthy disagreements to me. They don't seem constructive to me. They seem harsh. They seem judgmental. But at the same time, I think this is part of the problem, that we live in a time, like we were just talking about objective truth, we live in a time where we don't want to clearly define anything as a society. So how can you have a constructive conversation when you don't even agree on basic definitions and basic concepts? And quite frankly, in this realm or in this context, we're talking about something that is the most serious thing. We're talking about souls and eternal life, whether or not people believe it. So there's really no room to mess around too much, or to be considerate, or to not hurt feelings. I mean, this is real stuff, This is not. We're gonna watch the Dodgers get their asses kicked in the World Series, and I'm gonna be pissed off and throw a temper tantrum. This is, hey, there's right and wrong, and I need you to know what's right, and I need you to know what's wrong because I want to get you to heaven.
Yeah, heaven and hell hangs in the balance.
Yeah.
That the reality of that is too frightening for words.
Right.
So we have an obligation, a duty that's becoming more and more clear in this day and age that we have to speak up more.
Well, and I suppose I don't want to. My intention is not to make anyone feel badly, but I want people to understand the very real urgency of what's going on. Because I think when, if it's like, oh, it's okay, we can deal with this later, we don't have to, no, I mean, do I think the second coming will be tomorrow? No. But
you could die tomorrow.
I could die in a car accident driving to work.
That is, and
then
are you ready?
And when I'm sitting at judgment time, it's going to be, how well did you love me? And part of that means, how well did you care for my flock? And that doesn't leave much room for me to worry about. I mean, sure, there's a way to be compassionate and loving. I don't mean to make it sound like we need to be like harsh and rude. The saints were polite people and they were joyful. So I don't mean to make it sound like this incredibly negative thing, but my point is that there has to be a sense of sternness and there has to be a sense of urgency when we talk about these matters.
I agree. I would love, can we give our audience a little bit of a broad strokes overview about the matters that we'll be talking about? We've kind of thrown some topics around, but we have a plan, believe it or not. We have a plan about what we would like to talk about, what we'd like to examine with each episode. Did you want to jump on in?
Yeah. Why don't you run down the list?
Okay, cool. We have our first five, so to speak, and starting from the last ones, family, priesthood, and sacrifice. That's each episode would be a topic that we would want to discuss. So what is family? What does that mean? Defining that and then going into our respective roles within it. What is priesthood? Like, for example, I heard the term, I have faith in the priesthood, but not in priests. What does that mean? In this time of church scandal where all of the abuses of the priesthood are coming to light, well, not all of them, but so many of them are coming to light. How do we examine that? What do we think of priests in this time? And then sacrifice. Well, that's a great one for sports, no?
Absolutely.
Now, what is the role of sacrifice in our day-to-day life? How do we, like Jordan Peterson says...
And I like that nuance,
yeah.
Because, again, I think it's easy to talk about sacrifice in the larger moments. And I think those are ways usually people think about it, or at least maybe have a tendency to think about it because it is easier. So I think that it's always in the day-to-day that's more difficult, but in many ways so much more important.
Absolutely. In the daily life. I would like just to close the loop a bit. Something I had heard from Jordan Peterson recently, the great Canadian psychiatrist and professor, talking about how what does it take, what true heroism consists of is someone finding the heaviest burden he can bear and bearing it, and that sounds like something Fulton J. Sheen would say.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, but I don't necessarily disagree with it.
Fair enough. We'll have to go into that deeper. And then a broad strokes overview of virtue.
Yeah.
Before we break them up into individual pieces, but looking at them together. That sounds like a heavy Aristotle type of thing, or Augustine. We'll have to be doing our homework for that one.
Yeah.
But we do have something... it's very heavy on my heart that it's been growing on my mind that I wanted to talk about first, and that would be our first individual episode. And I think you know what we're talking about.
Of course, yes. So James and I put together a list of things or topics that we wanted to address, and we each of us gave each topic a number as a ranking on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, 1 being the lowest, and we added up our individual scores to get a total, and there was only one topic that scored a 20. And it's someone who, I mean, we both love Jesus. He's very near and dear to our hearts. But in a special way, so is this person. And it's, as Fulton Sheen describes her, it's the world's first love, and that would be our Blessed Mother Mary.
And because we love him, we love her. It's an honor to him that we dare, the fact that we dare to love the man who became the word that became flesh. Because we dare to love that being, that God man, we also love his mother.
And her response to that, I think, I don't claim to know what Mary thinks, but to me, her response would be something along the lines of, you should love him. And that's the beautiful thing about Mary, is she always points us back towards Christ. And it's a beautiful relationship because Christ points us towards his mother as a means to him, and she absolutely encourages us to return to him with perfect humility and with perfect love.
And this is a little bit out of right field. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here. I wanted to... given that we both feel this way, I was wondering if we could dedicate this podcast to Christ, but through his mother.
Yeah, maybe yeah.
So that he could... my thought, it's been growing in my mind almost as everything that I do is so incomplete in so many different ways. I do it... I always strive in my art for perfection, or to at least live up to that little spark of creation that I first perceived in my head, and it comes out so dim and so oftentimes disappointing. But the thing that I love about even this incomplete work is that Mary is a mother, and a mother can take this crude drawing that their child has drawn and still pin it up on the fridge and make us feel like it is complete, that it is beautiful. And so what I was hoping to do with this little podcast is to give it to Mary, our mother, and say, look, make this something that is worthy of your son, that might help his kingdom here on earth. Arrange it such that it does move hearts and minds, not especially our own, to follow him better. Put it up on God's fridge for us. And so I think if we can take these stumbling first steps, but take them for Our Lady, to bring them to Christ and make it better, make it more complete, make it fitting of him, then maybe we won't go wrong. Maybe we won't go entirely wrong.
Yeah, I suppose the only thing I would add is if it's his will.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope so.
Yeah.
So that's our first episode is on Mary. And this isn't the end of the episode, and I didn't mean to feel like it make you, our audience, think that we're ending the episode by talking about a dedication. But that'll be to come.
But that's one of the things that James and I want to do too with this podcast. I mean, we want you, our audience, to hear our authenticity and sincerity. Tell us, I have no idea how any of you will receive this, but we're both pretty sincere with where we're coming from, and so there might be some times where we're a little raw, and we might be rambling too much, or
Barnaby might have to hit the bleep button. He can't find it, he says.
Speaking of which, maybe we should let the audience get to know our sound engineer, since I will often be referring to him as our guardian angel of this show. Yeah. So what's your name? Where are you from?
We introduced him earlier, Andrew.
Oh, I know, but we're circling back, James.
My name is Barnaby Coxon. I'm from New Zealand.
Your favorite sport is rugby. What's your favorite food?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
I think eggs. I love eggs. Every morning, man.
That's an unusual choice.
Now, Barnaby, our listeners have had a chance to kind of get a sense of where James and I are coming from, but do you mind sharing with us what inspired you to help us out, and how you got involved with this little project?
Yeah, so I've known James for a while now, and he connected with me and asked me about helping out and kind of sponsoring this podcast with my help. And I've been married for 6 years. I'm 26 years old. I got married at 20, or I just turned 21, and that has taught me a lot. Being married has taught me a lot about what it means to be a man. In my relationship with my wife, Brooke, the values that I hold kind of reflected on her and in our relationship. And so for that reason, I just thought this was a great opportunity to lend my talents to a great topic, to something that needs to be talked about, and B, for me to learn as well. I think there are a lot of opinions out there. You're constantly hearing things and seeing things that influence your thoughts and what you think the ideal man should be. And for me, first and foremost, the idea of what a good man does come from Scripture. And I think that is what should influence that idea. But I think, that being said, there is so much around us in culture and everything that applying that looks a certain way. And I think the discussion that needs to happen is about, what does that look like? What are the various areas of our lives that we need to focus on and be able to kind of realize and kind of grow to become the man and the men that God wants us to be. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
I love that because
Very inspirational.
it does. It behooves us to use Scripture. That's something that as Catholics we often have we have a lack of knowledge in that area in Scripture, and that's a general thing. But just the Gospels, the love of the Gospels is sometimes lost on us because we take it for granted. We're in Mass, we hear it maybe not every day, but every week, and they're incredible. The man that we find within the Gospels, Jesus Christ, the God-man, the stories that are in the story of Jesus Christ is so far beyond any story that you or I could tell. It's so far beyond. I mean, it had its seeds in the Old Testament. Obviously, it had his seeds in the in some of the myths that we find in our old in the old of antiquity. But the idea that God, the omnipresent God, bent down to us and walked among us, not masquerading. Now, he wasn't masquerading as a man, but was a man in all of his all of the mundane aspects of humanity. What a story. And that's in the Gospels. And that's so good that we have that type of reminder because it is something we take for granted too often.
Yeah, and I think that there's it's easy to associate the Gospels or conflate the Gospels with the homily given on Sunday. You know what I mean?
Not exactly.
I think that for a person who doesn't spend time or isn't intentional about connecting with Scripture, or someone who maybe hasn't been well catechized in his or her faith, it can be easy to go to Mass and their takeaway from the Gospels is just what they hear on Sunday. And it kind of puts an undue pressure on the priest to bring the Gospels to life, when in reality the Gospels should really be speaking for themselves, and the priests are there to sort of guide our interpretation or our understanding specific to the times that we live in. I think that could go a lot of different directions, and I know it's a much more full conversation, so I don't mean to make it sound like that's an all-inclusive answer of what the homily is meant for. But my larger point is that it can be easy to disassociate from Scripture and from the Gospels when a person isn't engaging them on a regular basis or a consistent basis. And that's why it's so important to know Christ. I mean, for any good person, let alone men, any good person has to know Christ. That means time in prayer, time with the Scriptures, time in community, time in service.
As Mother Teresa says, Christ in his distressing disguise of the poor.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad. I think we need it. I just made a note. We have to do an episode on spiritual warfare, and we need to do an episode on the Gospels, or many episodes.
Yeah, that'd be good. I mean, I don't know what the best way to do that would be, so I feel like we should.
We'll talk.
We should talk. Yeah, exactly.
Talk offline.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to we need to get in our segment where we talk about, we want to have segments on a recurring basis where we talk about different things on a regular basis, such as James and Andrew read the news, or go to the ballpark, or different things like that. We'll surprise you from time to time. But let's have a James and Andrew read the news.
Yeah. So, it's funny that you, I don't know about funny, maybe it's all part of God's plan. But recently I went to Politicon, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's like Comic-Con but with politics. And my political leaning is to the right. I am conservative. I'll be very upfront and honest about that. I'm certainly open to dialogue. So I went on what I deemed Conservative Sunday, which is when a lot of well-known conservative pundits and commentators were going to be speaking at Politicon. And I have to say I was pretty encouraged, because two of the more well-known faces on the conservative side are Ben Shapiro and Michael Knowles. And Ben Shapiro is libertarian, and he's Jewish. And for those of you who are familiar with politics, libertarians, or I should say political philosophy, libertarians often scare me because they think that we're in control of our own destiny. They don't seem to have, in terms of how they interpret politics and laws, they don't seem to think it's necessary for the government to provide as much guidance as someone who's more conservative or more Republican might. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we can have a more full discussion at another time, or maybe through, whatever. Find me outside of this podcast and I'll talk to you about it. But my larger point is that Shapiro took the stance that when it comes to questions of morality, he specifically brought up abortion. It's wrong, and there's really no way around it. And the other guy, Michael Knowles, is Catholic, and similar feelings, just as strong. And so I guess I just want to make the point that it can be easy to not get involved or not know what's going on with politics because it's messy and because it's dirty and because there aren't a lot of virtuous people who are running for positions. I've certainly been there. I've certainly tapped out and been apathetic for stretches of my life. But it is important. You should be informed. These are the people who are guiding our country, and we should have an active voice and what the values of our society are. And one of the ways in which we do that is by voting. And so with the elections coming up, I just want to take the time to make a plug. Take it to prayer. Do your homework.
That's the key point. That's the key. Like we always hear, and I'm sorry to cut in, but I want to say that because it gets on my nerves so much. We always hear, "Get out and vote." I think the celebrities, "Get out and vote." Well, okay, no, don't get out. If you don't know what the person you're voting for stands for, don't vote. Don't vote, because you know what? The right to vote is the right to kill, because the people you're voting for make decisions that end life effectively and on a massive scale. So if you're not knowing what the international affairs are of the person you're voting for, or what their stance is on end of life matters or abortion or things that kill or do not kill, don't vote. And don't vote because you think that, we have a guy that is the hip, new, good-looking guy. That is not the or because he's or she is sensitive to the matters of the poor or different things like that.
Environment.
Or the environment. I mean, there is so much that is beyond just a general sense of compassion. Just a general sense of compassion could lead to more death.
Well, Fulton Sheen talks about the difference between false compassion and compassion, like actual compassion.
Can you speak a little bit to it?
I don't remember it. I watched it a couple years ago. But he addresses. Actually, it's funny. He very prophetic in a lot of what he says and writes. But for anyone who's curious about this, I encourage you to go watch. It's on YouTube. Just Google "false compassion" Fulton Sheen. Should come right up.
Fulton Sheen, Sheen, like Tiger Blood, Charlie Sheen guy.
Yeah. And he speaks to a lot of what James is getting at.
Yeah, and just so people don't know who this guy is, he was Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen was,
I believe he's venerable now.
Yeah, he's a venerable now, and he was also he ran the most popular TV show of the 50s, Life is Worth Living. So not only is he on his path to sainthood, he is also he's also someone who is incredibly current with the times that he lived in, which were not so long ago. So there's a wealth of recording and writings that you can access about this man who's incredibly wise, that are incredibly relevant to our day.
Yeah, and just to keep with the current non-structure of this particular episode of our podcast, he wrote a great book on Mary called The World's First Love, as I mentioned when we brought this up for the first time. But great book. Strongly recommend you read it. Very powerful. It would be a good, definitely give you more information than James and I can on Mary. It's not only a great introduction, it's very informative and gives you a pretty complete picture as well. So I encourage people to read that book. But anyway, getting back to our news, that's about all I had, is just for people to get out and vote and be informed. And yeah, and take it to prayer. You know, I don't really understand why people are reluctant to segregate or separate or isolate their daily or routine activities from prayer. It's something that just doesn't make sense to me. So the more we can offer brushing our teeth up as a form of prayer, the more in touch we are with God, the better off we're going to be. So I encourage you, especially with important matters like voting or leading any sort of group, things of that nature especially, I encourage you to take those things to prayer.
Wonderful. For my news headline, I was browsing LifeSite News, a great source of news that you won't find on most sites that have been posited to be fake news sites. And the headline that caught my eye was, Philadelphia prepares to sell off Kermit Gosnell's House of Horrors abortion building. And if you don't know who Kermit Gosnell is, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this name properly because I haven't seen this movie yet, But there's a documentary out about this man who was an abortionist who was under indictment back in 2013 for 8 different charges of murder. And his story is blood curdling. He comes from my hometown of Houston, or I'm not sure if he came from it, but he set up his House of Horrors in Houston for a while. And the stories that come, I browsed through I browsed through some of the notes from the trial that was going through, and the stories that they were telling about the partial birth abortions where the babies were trying to get away, like trying to survive, while as they were being flushed down the toilet because the failed abortions didn't actually kill them, are incredibly horrific. And this site and these details are not. They were from the Washington Examiner. They weren't from LifeSite News when I was browsing them. So, I would encourage you when you are looking at your movies that are out this weekend, check out the Gosnell documentary that's out in a theater near you. It's been out for a couple weeks now. I need to check it out. I haven't checked it out yet. Hopefully I'll have a chance to check it out this weekend with everything else that's going on. But that was the Philadelphia House of Horrors is on sale now. Thanks be to God. There will not. Hopefully, that's actually a good Halloween thing. Hopefully, that there will be no more House of Horrors to destroy the lives of innocent children. So, that is my headline for the day. But speaking of death, speaking of destruction, how about that World Series?
I knew that was coming. I knew that was on its way.
Dodger fan. I'm sitting.
I mean, honestly, I'm surprised they got one game. I think the thing that was heartbreaking to me was not that they lost the series. I expected them to lose in 4, quite frankly. But it was just how they lost game 4.
That was heartbreaking.
Up 4 runs in the top of the 7th. That's what the Dodgers have done all year. They haven't been able to close games, and they haven't put guys when guys have been in scoring position, they haven't put the ball in play, and that's what happens when you stop playing small ball and try to hit home runs. And that's what happens that's why you lose 8-4 to a team that does play small ball when you don't. I really think it's that simple, which actually speaks to the importance of disposition and approach to things that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Dodgers team was built on the long ball, and they had lived and died by it the whole year, and it looked bad going into the series, to be honest. Like you said, I was not bullish on my predictions for this series, especially coming off watching heartbreakingly how the Red Sox beat the Astros in the AL Championship Series. It was just, it was the Red Sox year.
They beat them in 6 games, right?
5
games, yeah. So
it was the Red Sox year.
Yeah, I mean their bats were just too hot. Their pitching was pretty good early on, and maybe even midway through the season, but.
And I remember we talked about this earlier where I said, they're going to cool off in September. And you were like, I don't know, man. They're not going to cool off. I think they look too good. Well, if we had good thing we didn't put money on that.
Just under 110 wins. I think they had, 108?
108.
108 wins before the playoffs. Win the World Series, pretty much averaging 8 runs a game. They might not have averaged 8 throughout the playoffs, but in their last 2 series, I think they averaged 7 or 8 runs a game.
Well, that's the baseball season.
Yeah.
There we go. And now the best time of the year starts, the Hot Stove League. That's too much. That's too optimistic. It's not the best time of the year. It's actually a horrible time of the year. But it's something we can.
I was going to say playoff baseball just ended. I don't know.
Yeah. It's not the best time, but it's still fun. I try and look for the positive in it.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, just because it's not the best doesn't mean that it's not good.
Yeah. Playoff baseball is pretty good, but I just love summer baseball in general. Like just sitting back and watching a game, cold beer, or just falling asleep like at night, like just listening to the radio, or oh man.
Yeah.
The voice of my child is Milo Hamilton. Milo Hamilton. Your voice of the Houston Astros, Milo and the Ash.
There you go. I'm not too familiar with Milo, but
Well, Vin, you had Vin,
I did.
Vin
Best
Scully.
announcer in the history of baseball.
arguably. I mean, for me, my favorite announcer was Milo. Milo Hamilton.
But your favorite does not mean that he was the best.
Yeah, this is one of the moments where I wouldn't plead objective truth. This is more of in the subjective realm. But we didn't introduce that segment, but that's our James and Andrew Go to the Ballpark segment.
Yeah, I mean, there's really not much to say about that right now, or at least nothing constructive, because Dodgers just got destroyed. It's really what we just witnessed the last 5 days, and they decided to win a game in dramatic fashion.
That was fun.
Only to extend the pain of it's like when you break up with someone, or actually it's more like getting broken up with. And rather than just cutting things off, you decide that you're going to talk to her for a few more months or an extra couple of weeks or whatever. Like, that's basically what the Dodgers just did to their fans. Like, rather than just letting things end and letting it go and letting us all move on with our lives and feel okay, they decided to send that, like, extra couple text messages or that phone call.
That had us on the hook a little longer.
Yeah, and it wasn't even like a clean win. Like, they still had to do it in dramatic fashion. Like, I almost died of a heart attack the night they won.
Hey, that was fun, though.
Sure, James, but it would have been more fun if they had won the World Series. If they were going to lose, they should have just lost. Especially after what we had to deal with your Astros last year.
Oh, that was a good series, though.
Yeah, but that one was okay because they had a legitimate chance of winning until Yu Darvish started Game 7. I'm very angry about this whole thing, folks, so forgive me if I sound upset.
We won't get him started about taking Rich Hill out.
Let's not go there. Let's not talk about Dave Roberts and his inability to manage in the playoffs, but particularly the World Series. Let's not play our best 3 batters or 4 batters because they're left-handed. It makes no sense. Part of being a good man, since we're on this topic and this is the name of our podcast, is having common sense. If you lack common sense, it's going to be difficult for you to succeed at anything, in my opinion. Dave Roberts, I'm mad at you.
This has been James and Andrew Go to the Ballpark. Now we should move on to our James and Andrew Have Random Thoughts segment.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's kind of what we've been doing this whole podcast.
So this has been James and Andrew Have Random Thoughts. But before we do any sign off, though, I'd love to have a call to action for our listeners, our new listeners. Like, comment, follow. We're going to be on YouTube. We're going to be on iTunes. Like, comment, and follow our podcast in whatever medium you're doing. Send us in questions. Join our email list.
Are we going to create a Facebook page?
You want to do that?
Maybe. We might have a Facebook page. We'll get back to you.
And we will have an email list that you can jump on to ask questions or things like that. So please join the email list. Also, I'd like to invite you guys to join in whatever social medias. Follow us in our whatever social medias. I can be found at jp2.anu. My name is James Austin Pinello II, and so JP2 are my initials. And so you can find me jp2.anu on Instagram. That's my Instagram handle. Andrew, do you have any social that you can give to our followers?
Just Facebook. That's it. Andrew Kalinsky.
How about you, Barnaby? Any social you'd like people to find you on?
Yeah, I have a new website launching soon.
Really?
Yeah.
How exciting.
Yeah.
What's it
just
for?
BarnabyCoxon.com.
And what is it for, Barnaby?
It's for my audio engineering work.
Oh,
this kind of stuff.
This is what you do full time?
This is it. Podcasts, audiobooks.
Nobody does it better, folks. So look up that website because it is completely worth the trip.
What's the website again, Barnaby?
It's BarnabyCoxon.com.
And this is his beautiful studio. So Thank you for having us in here, Barnaby.
My pleasure.
All right. So that we've had the call to action, but that is really just a part of call to action. Like the real call to action that we are giving you is to go out and find that good man. Be that good man, because a good man is hard to find.
Yeah, I just feel like that's a tall order.
But it's possible, Andrew. But it's possible. But we don't take it for granted.
Yeah. Give yourself time. Be patient.
Because after all, a good man is hard to find.